Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little music chat about Claudia Cassidy, the Chicago Symphony, and Rafael Kubelik. Because every time this subject comes up, and it does quite frequently, because we talk about recordings and we talk about these conductors, Kubelik, Martinol, the ones who she supposedly didn't like. We get some business about this evil woman who chased them out of Chicago, and wasn't that terrible? No, it wasn't terrible. She was an excellent critic, and she was right. She was completely right, especially about Kubelik. And I'm going to tell you why. One of the things about Claudia Cassidy, and I've studied her and written papers about her and read all of her reviews, it's really very, very interesting, aside from the fact that she was never taken seriously because she was a woman, number one. But number two is that in order to understand what she was doing, you have to understand what the situation was in Chicago at the time that she was writing. And remember, she was not talking about records. She did record reviews. She did a lot of record reviews. But her job was to review live performances. And she was not just the music critic. She was the theater critic and the dance critic and the opera critic. She was some critic, let me tell you. And she knew a lot about everything. She had a fascinating life. But in terms of her artistic, the breadth of her artistic knowledge and endeavors. She was a Illinois native. She lived to be 90 something. She was born like in 1899. She died in like 1991 or something, 90 or something like that. So she was there on the ground, and she knew Chicago. She knew Chicago cultural life. And she was determined as a critic that Chicago should never be treated as America's second city. She believed that Chicago had one of the great orchestras, that it was built that way under Theodore Thomas and Friedrich Stock, and that after he died in like 1940-something, they had a fallow period, conductor-wise. They had Desiree Defoe, they had Arthur Rudzinski, and they were both disasters. And then they got Kubelik. And she had no patience for the politics that necessarily attended hiring a music director, because we all know what happens. We have no patience for it. The same things that she objected to are the same things that a lot of you object to. The fact that musical merit seldom comes into consideration, that the music world is full of, back patting and back scratching and brown nosing and who's sleeping with who and political considerations that have nothing to do with music. She was completely opposed to all of that. And she felt, when Kubelik came to Chicago, she felt that he wasn't ready. She felt that Chicago had a great orchestra, that it had consistency of leadership for many decades under Stock. And she said that Chicago is a world-class orchestra. It should have a world-class conductor. And Kubelik was not a world-class conductor. That he later became one is completely irrelevant. We need to keep in mind that when Kubelik arrived in Chicago, he was young, he was controversial, he was untested, he had not led major orchestra for any length of time. He had no record of achievement behind him. She had heard him conduct before. She went to Europe every summer and fall or whatever, when the season was in those days. And she went principally to listen to opera recordings. And she heard all of these conductors work in Europe, and she was not impressed with him. And as a result of that, when he wound up in Chicago, she told them in no uncertain terms that it was the wrong choice. And it was the wrong choice because he did not know how to run a world-class orchestra, and he wasn't a world-class musician. And at that point, he was not. You can look at his recorded legacy from that era. I mean, nowadays, because he made some fabulous recordings for Mercury Living Presence, some, not uniformly, and a very limited number. We talk about, what a genius, how fabulous and terrific he was, because we love Mercury, and because we love, the Mavlast and the pictures at an exhibition and the Hindemith and some of the things that he did. But the reality was he was untested in the standard German repertoire, and his recordings of that repertoire for Mercury Living Presence have never been, Brahms and whatnot, have never been all that highly praised. In those days, a conductor of a major orchestra, especially a major American orchestra, had to have the German standards. Beethoven, Brahms, those people. And Kubelik was never known for his treatment of those composers, not even in his later life, not even his Beethoven cycle, which he did with all the 9 different orchestras, or his Brahms cycle, which was on Orfeo, which was not really all that special. And if you look at the reviews that Kubelik was getting for his recordings on EMI, works that he often did later, like the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, Janáček, Frescoes of Piero della Francesca, Martinu, Frescoes of Piero della Francesca, and Janáček stuff, they were not getting uniformly fantastic write-ups. People were equivocal, let's put it that way. And she did not want an artist who was less than first class, less than tested at the helm of the Chicago Symphony. And so she fought. She fought his appointment. But then when you started to look at the programs that he did, you realize that he really wasn't ready for it. He was not ready to take over a major orchestra. He couldn't program a season in an effective way, or he didn't, let's put it this way, have the cachet to do some of the things he did and get away with it in the context of a major season at a major American orchestra like that. I mean, I've looked at the programs and I've read the reviews, and she could be vicious. She was intolerant because she was, they told her she was wrong and she should shut up. She did just the opposite. I get all of that. But fundamentally, basically, her heart was in the right place and her reasoning made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense. If I had been in Chicago in the 1950s, the mid-50s, and they announced Rafael Kubelik was taking over, I would have just gone, huh? Because look who they got after that. Reiner, right? I mean, there was Reiner, there was Sell. She had issues with all of these people, one way or another, but there were bigger names that she felt deserved that position before Rafael Kubelik. And so she felt that Chicago was getting shortchanged. And then when his program turned out to be less than interesting, and his conducting turned out to be extremely erratic, which it always was throughout his career, it always was, one way or another, she felt she was being proved right. And so after 3 years, he left. And remember, Kubelik did not settle down until he actually got Bavarian Radio, which was quite a bit later. Quite a bit later. He was supposed to take over Covent Garden. That lasted like 10 minutes. He had difficulty getting on with management. He was a difficult character, and he was an artistically immature character. And she knew all that. And you can see that very clearly. That's what the fight was. So when he finally left, people pointed the finger at her. But no one points the finger at Kubelik. Nobody says, he wasn't ready. He wasn't happy. He wanted to do other things. All of those were factors. It wasn't just Claudia Cassidy, the malevolent presence, the wicked bitch of the West, as she was called by her detractors. And the issue with Jean Martinon was even less clear-cut, because as I mentioned, the orchestra didn't like him, management didn't like him, and he still stayed there for 5 years. Let's not forget, Martinon was there from 63 to 68. Nowadays, that's considered pretty damn good. Despite what Claudia Cassidy wanted, Schulte wouldn't show up until Cassidy, they promised, until Cassidy retired, effectively. She did radio and other things after that, but she retired from the newspaper. And that was because she had trashed Schulte years earlier when he came as a visiting opera conductor. And Schulte misquoted her and said things about her that simply weren't true. If you actually look at what he said in his biography and whatnot, as opposed to what he wrote, of what she actually wrote about him and why she wrote it, you realize that it was Schulte who was doing the bad mouthing, not Claudia Cassidy. So I raise this issue because I think it's very, very important, especially when we talk about people's posthumous reputations. And because I'm a critic and sort of a student of the art, frankly, that you understand, we all have to understand what the circumstances were at the time in question, and what her reservations were, and what she was protesting. It isn't enough to just get out there and facilely say, oh, she chased Kubelik away, and Kubelik was a genius. Well, that's bullshit. First of all, she didn't chase him away, and second of all, he wasn't a genius. She wrote what she thought was an honest appraisal of his work in Chicago. And in order to know whether it was or wasn't, we would have had to be aware, at least, of what his work in Chicago was. And that means more than just a few Mercury Living Presence recordings. That means the actual work of the 3 seasons that he was there as a conductor, and how she was she knew. She'd heard great recordings of the Brahms First Symphony. She could judge, she could compare those to his and render a verdict. So other people may have been friendlier towards him for various reasons. They may have liked the amount of contemporary music he did or unusual repertoire. I probably would have. But again, that wasn't the issue. She had her audience. She wrote for them. She spoke for them. And she had a very, very clear view of what she thought was appropriate. And so I'm just telling you all, from now on, I don't want to hear any nonsense about, oh, Claudia Cassidy this and Claudia Cassidy that. Read her reviews. Look at what she said and what she did. And you'll come to a rather different conclusion, I know, if you're fair, if you're honest about it. Does that mean she was always right? No. Does that mean she wasn't nasty? No, she was nasty as hell sometimes. But she was a pro, a serious professional who deserves our respect and consideration. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.